My dear viewers and listeners, hello and welcome to my YouTube channel Misha Impossible. My name is Mikhail Sergeyev, and today we begin a series of talks about philosophical hermeneutics. Our first talk will be devoted to the legacy of Immanuel Kant's transcendental philosophy concerning the development of hermeneutics. To begin with, let us recall some of the basic ideas of Kant's philosophy as presented in the Critique of Pure Reason. In his first critique, Kant distinguishes two kinds of knowledge, a priori and a posteriori. A priori knowledge is identified by its universal and necessary character. Pure a priori knowledge contains no admixture of the empirical. However, a priori knowledge is not always pure, as in applied mathematics, for example. Finally, a posteriori knowledge is any knowledge received by experience. Another distinction in the critique is made regarding judgments. According to Kant, there are two types of judgment: analytic judgments, which are explicative, uninformative, and necessary, are a priori. For example, all bachelors have no wives. They follow the criteria of analyticity, which is the principle of contradiction. Synthetic judgments, in their turn, are ampliative, meaning extending or adding to that which is already known. They are also informative and go beyond the concept. Hence, we have the following types of judgments. Number one, a posteriori synthetic. Number two, a priori analytic. And number three, a priori synthetic. Kant thought that philosophers before him had limited human knowledge to the first two types. They assumed that all analytical statements were a priori judgments, and all a posteriori or empirical judgments have a synthetic character. Kant, in his turn, was confident that he had discovered a new kind of knowledge called synthetic a priori, to which belong mathematical, purely scientific, and metaphysical truths. His main concern was in justifying the possibility of such knowledge. Thus, Kant's project might be described in the following way. How are synthetic a priori judgments possible? In other words, how do mathematics, pure science, and metaphysics contain positive knowledge, if any? Generally speaking, Kant gives a positive answer to the first two problems while denying the cognitive value of traditional metaphysical theories. Kant thought that there are three separated fields: pure reason, practical reason, judgment, in which reason operates. In the first critique, he analyzes the limits of pure reason, that is, theoretical reason, which is free from anything empirical. In contrast to his predecessors, Hume and Leibniz, Kant postulates that there is a quantitative and qualitative difference between thinking and sensible perceptions. Our empirical cognition cannot be reduced to a priori knowledge. The latter, in its turn, is restricted to the domain of possible sensory experience, which it anticipates with regard not to the content, but the form, of such experience. Hence, Kant distinguishes three faculties of human cognition. The pure theoretical reason for Kant is the source of all a priori knowledge and is identified with two faculties. The first one is called in German Verstand and translated as understanding. It is the faculty of scientific reasoning. The second, named Vernunft, or in English speculative reason, is concerned with metaphysical thinking. The third faculty, which is associated with empirical knowledge and represents the capacity for receiving representations through being affected by objects, is called sensibility. What sensibility produces is pointed out to be intuitions, which, as Kant notices, are either empirical, sensations, or pure. While the objects provide the content of intuitions, their form belongs to the way humans perceive these very objects. Thus, Kant affirms space and time to be such a priori forms of cognition. By this move, Kant justifies the possibility of mathematics as synthetic a priori knowledge. Human cognition, according to Kant, begins with sensation. Sensation originates in the so-called noumenal world and does not have an object. It is followed by the pure intuition of time and space, which allows us to organize our empirical intuitions of this, here, and now. Intuitions, in their turn, are fulfilled with perception, characterized by conceptualization. The undetermined objects of empirical intuitions correspond to the realm of appearances, while the objects of conceptualized intuitions belong to the domain of phenomenon. The latter experience is universally valid. Phenomenal experience, as I said before, is universally valid. On the other hand, experience takes us from merely subjective to objective judgments. Finally, universal validity can follow only from our subjective constitution, hence from the pure concepts of understanding or categories. Therefore, all objects of possible experience are subject to the categories. Those categories are subjectively originated but objectively valid because they represent the a priori conditions of any possibility of knowledge. Where can those categories be derived from? First, according to Kant, categories or concepts are forms or rules of synthesis. Second, they belong to the understanding, which is, by Kant's definition, the faculty of judgment. Third, Kant claims that to judge is to think, and the forms of judgment are already known from the formal logic. Therefore, he concludes, the pure concepts of understanding could be discovered from the forms of judgments. Without going into any further details, let me note that Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy consisted of the following fact. Before Kant, philosophers were convinced that our knowledge must conform with the objects. Kant turned this around and proved that the objects must conform to our knowledge of them. The central question of the critique is how science is possible. The originality of modern science, according to Kant, is rooted in the belief that nature by itself is mute. It cannot communicate with us. We have to force this silent nature to communicate to our natural reason the multitude of things. Science became an inquiry very similar to the Inquisition. Thus, Kantian philosophy asserts that the other of reason cannot initiate communication with reason in natural sciences. Therefore, the theoretical or scientific reason is charged with the responsibility to provide itself with its object. That is what Kant calls a priori. What is then a posteriori? A posteriori demands to begin with given objects. It means that one is not responsible for the way objects appear. So in empirical relation to reality, we assume that objects initiate a conversation with our reason. In theoretical reasoning, on the contrary, we realize that objects are the results of this reasoning. For nature to be an object is already meant to be drawn into a dialogue with reason. Kantian a priorism reversed this situation by claiming that reason has to take responsibility for defining its objects. Since Kant, nature is by definition a reality that is deprived of any initiative in starting communicative relationship with human reason. What is objective for Kant? Objectivity for Kant means the otherness of reason. To say how reason relates to objectivity, or in other words, how natural sciences are possible, we have to know how reason manages to express the otherness of its other. For the other of reason or nature cannot even express its otherness. Nature is not just silent or refuses to communicate with us, which would have been a sign of communication. Nature is voiceless. The only way to communicate with it is to provide the expression of its otherness and then to bridge ourselves with this other, which received from us the expression of its otherness. Hence, since Kant and modern science, humankind discovered for the first time, at least in the West, the unmastered nature that stands in opposition to culture. Such an opposition that did not exist in classical thinking was the origin of the split between the sciences of nature and sciences of culture. This split, in its turn, lies at the very heart of the development of hermeneutics. The theme of the sciences about spirit versus sciences about nature enters the field of hermeneutics in Dilthey's thought. It is closely related to different interpretations of the faculty of understanding from Dilthey to Gadamer. Finally, it echoes in Ricoeur's preoccupation with the opposition between explanation and comprehension. And this concludes our first segment about philosophical hermeneutics. Please leave your questions, comments, and suggestions in the chat section under this video. Also, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and push the little bell button to receive further notifications about our new videos. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant rest of the day and take care of yourself.